Hi, welcome to another brand new episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. And today we have a special guest. We have our very first critic slash author, Kristen Lopez. It's so good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Now the book she has written is entitled Popcorn Disability: The Highs and Lows of Disabled Representation in the Movies. And before we get started, I wanted to say I was infatuated with this book because I was recommended to it. I had seen other documentaries or maybe books that talked a little bit about the portrayal of characters with disabilities in movies, but also maybe briefly talked about them in television. So I thought the way you categorized each of the different tropes and the different parts of film history were very interesting. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for reading it for starters. Anybody that bothers to read the book, I'm always very happy. But I'm glad that you got the context behind it and you found it interesting. Hopefully you found it fun.
Hmm.
So thank you. Yeah, thank you for all of that.
Okay, so before we get started, I did put down a little bit of the notes. So you started the book with, we always have to go back to the beginning of the movies, the early examples that you pointed out, and I'll just name a few. You mentioned The Penalty, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Phantom of the Opera, and The Man Who Laughs, all from the silent period, like transitioning into sound. Then you went into a full chapter on the movie Freaks, which I had done a review of this film years ago before I had done this podcast when I was at Hillsborough Community College. And then you had done a brief, well, not brief, you had done a chapter on disabled actors and directors that not a lot of people may know about. And then you had also done on four, which I thought was pretty interesting. The war years and the bitter cripple, as you called the trope. The full, you never go full retard, which is in reference to a movie you mentioned in your book, and I think was mentioned, Tropic Thunder, and the controversy surrounding that movie. Then we have, of course, the disabled horror. We have Black and Disabled. And then we have caretaker cinema, pretty disabilities, as you call it, which I thought was a pretty interesting term. And I thought it was a pretty interesting phrase. And then you ended it with Crip It Up and the Oscar myth and the epilogue. So, what prompted you to categorize each of these tropes that I have mentioned into these chapters?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd initially kind of planned to do chronologically, and kind of go from the silent era to where we are today. And as I started to get into it, I realized that that chronology could kind of transition into more looking at why certain tropes fit their era. So, I knew I wanted to talk about World War II and the war years, but a lot of it was based around this one trope, which is, as I mentioned, the bitter cripple. And then, from there, as I started to really get into it, the chronology kind of faded away as we get into this post ADA world. And it became far more trope centric,
Mm,
So the horror is very much kind of 80s into the 90s. Then you have, the section I have on Black disabled characters that's certainly going to be more prevalent post-war than it would have been in the silent era. So it was a nice little, kind of weird twist as I started writing that I was like, oh, we're focused now less on time and
mm.
we're focused more on these tropes that kind of end up defining the time that they're in.
Mm. That does make a lot more sense because some of the chapters that I found pretty interesting, you mentioned in disabled horror in this chapter, and I put it into one of my notes here, that there were characters who could be coded as disabled in this genre, such as the Michael Myers character, Ghostface in the Scream franchise, or Jason Voorhees in the Friday the 13th franchise, and Leatherface. But you also mentioned a few wheelchair users in Friday the 13th Part 2, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Nightmare on Elm Street 3. Was it something that not a lot of people were paying attention to that maybe you wanted to put into this context?
Yeah, I mean, I had always known that I had always kind of perceived the monster characters as disabled. You got a lot of them in the 80s that are more overt. I mean, Jason Voorhees is pretty much presented, I think, in one and later as being possibly hydrocephalic. He has misshapen features. So, and most of the directors in doing research had all talked about how they wanted to be more overt in the portrayals of disability. Toby Hooper and the screenwriters for Texas Chainsaw talked about having this whole backstory for Leatherface as having these disabilities that they had kind of pulled back on because the studio believed that that would create too much empathy for
Hmm.
the character. This is a character you're supposed to hate. And I do think my quasi theory on why horror at this time was more amenable to presenting disabled characters is that we are getting into the arrival of the ADA. The ADA passes in the early 90s, but by the 1980s, you had a lot more civil rights discussion with regards to disability. Ronald Reagan comes into office and becomes very committed to revamping Social Security. He did a lot more harm than good, I think, but he put disability far more on the forefront of people's minds. And I think that filmmakers were like, it's kind of ridiculous if we don't include disability in some way. So I always appreciate that there's balance. So you have maybe a disabled character like Freddy Krueger, who is technically a burn victim, and then you get the character in Dream Warriors, who is a wheelchair user. You get Jason in Friday the 13th Part 2, and then you get Mark, who is the actual victim, one of the victims, many victims in that installment. And even in the 1970s, when you get Texas Chainsaw and you have Leatherface, who I think is still pretty empathetic somewhat in the film. You watch him be mistreated and kind of abused by his family, but then you get Franklin, who is the wheelchair user in that film. And he's a character that I came into that movie absolutely hating. And one of the things there's a lot of questions on social media about whether Franklin is one of the worst disabled characters on screen. But it was interesting to hear from a lot of people that kind of came at me and said why they think he's not, and talked about Vietnam and whether there's a question about whether Franklin was a Vietnam vet and the infantilization of disabled people in the 1970s. So I really think that it's fascinating to see as we start marching towards the passage of the ADA that there is this desire to create balance, that we don't just get disabled monsters, disabled villains, but we're also getting disabled heroes to kind of balance those scales. And then once the ADA passes, film and I think society seems to believe that we fixed everything. So you start to see a backslide. So it's a really nice little bevy of time, and horror has always been a genre hospitable to disabled characters, whether that is Frankenstein or the villains, but has always been open to having actual disabled heroes like we get with the Chucky films, with Nika Pierce, the Fiona Dorff character, Shape of Water with Sally Hawkins. Yes, these actors are not disabled, but the fact that we are getting far more disabled characters written in these movies than we are in any other genre is telling.
Yes, it is very telling. Yeah, but I want to go to the movie Freaks, which I loved how you covered it in this chapter, and I know that uh, you mentioned that how could one like a movie even though you're talking about these outdated stereotypes? Well, when I saw the film, I saw it more of as a soap opera set in the circus, which I thought you could have done a soap opera where you had disabled actors, but it's set in a circus and have that same situation. But the way that you frame it out, I understand that it was sort of being treated as it's debatable whether or not this movie is an exploitation film or it is a reinforcement of the stereotypes that were sort of coming from the Victorian eugenics period. So, I wanted to ask what your take. I know your book has a take on it, but what possessed you to make a whole chapter on this particular movie?
Yeah, I mean, Freaks holds a special place in my heart. It still holds the record for having the most physically disabled cast.
Hmm.
predominantly disabled cast. No film I think has even attempted to really touch that, no mainstream film at least. And so when I saw it the first time, as a person, either late in my high school career or early in my college career, I was very shocked by it, and I was very, very turned off. And a lot of that was my own internalized ableism. I had never seen physically disabled people that looked more like me than
Hmm.
anything else, and it was very shocking. And yet I was fascinated by it. I was fascinated by its history as this controversial, repellent film that was so dangerous and was, banned, and that people had these visceral responses to. And it's always been a movie that once I started doing research and realized how it affected Todd Browning's career, how it affected the actors that worked in it, it became kind of this little thing that I wanted to protect. And so, I've always championed it as an example of what disabled representation can look like, where we can build, how we can and make it better, and the fact that no other movie has made an effort to try to best it by having a predominantly disabled cast since 1932 is says a lot about Hollywood at this time. But I think that at the same time, the disabled community is not a monolith. For every person that loves it, I've met a disabled person that hates it, and I totally understand that. For me, it's a movie about the horrors of ableism and the horrors of this belief that disabled people are less. You look at this community of people, and that's what they are. They're a community of people that work in this industry as circus performers. Todd Browning had worked in the circus, and had bonded with a lot of these were people he knew in a way. These were people that he had interacted with, and he wanted to tell a story about the struggles that they experience. And I think why people, especially able-bodied people, get so turned off by it is that they're the villain.
Hmm.
You don't root for Cleopatra, the Olga Baklanova character, who is, attacked at the end of the movie.
Hmm.
You want something, you want her to get her comeuppance, because she's the villain, she's evil. And that's the movie also doesn't excuse, I think unintentionally so, it could not have known this at the time, but it doesn't excuse ableism in allies.
Hmm.
There's two able-bodied allies that are in the movie, that use the term freak to discuss these characters, and they do experience ableism. The Wallace Ford character Frozo
Hmm.
kind of treats some of the characters like children. So the movie, I think, also shows that not every able person, the microaggressions, these are
Hmm.
things that now I think give the movie even a richer layer, because you're realizing now we have words for what some of these things are. I think it's a movie that could not have known in 1932 how relevant it would become. And, to learn about how MGM kind of sabotaged it and
Hmm.
mistreated it, it's one of those moments in Hollywood where you're like, they've been doing the same thing to disabled people since 1932.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a movie that I hold, very close to me, because I think that it's one of those movies that made me think like, oh, actually people were doing this thing. They were
Hmm.
trying to, and they were, butting up against this system that was like, yeah, we don't want to see this.
Yeah, and look what happened to Harry Earls after he did this movie. He was in Oz as one of the members of the Lollipop Guild, as well as many other. And you described it in the book as they looked like little porcelain dolls, and it looked so disturbing and creepy to see them in that sequence.
Yeah, I mean, I get really honest about the fact that, I grew up without disabled role models. I'm the only disabled person in my family. I'm the only
Hmm.
person, at school, I was the only disabled person that I knew of. It wasn't until high school that I interacted with other disabled people. And when you have all that, you become there's a lot of weird feelings you get when you see disability on screen. And so, when I talk about the Munchkins in Wizard of Oz, those were my frame of reference, for
Hmm.
what I figured I would grow up into. They were small like me, they were compact. And I was like, oh my God, is that what I'm gonna, because I had no frame of
No.
reference,
Mm.
I had nothing to go off of except movies. And that I think is the lot of a lot of disabled people, is that you learn rightly or wrongly, people learn a lot about cultures and people and rites of passage from film, and they hold that as kind of their foundation. And when you have bad representation, or the only representation you're getting is these certain things, you internalize that in a really
Mhm.
weird way. So, for me watching The Munchkins, I was like, am I gonna look like some shellacked doll person? Like that's really and I also got a lot of people that would see me and assume I was a little person or assume I had dwarfism, which, I didn't as far as I knew, and I took that very personally. They were like, "Oh, you look like a munchkin." I'm like, "Nope, I am my own person. Like let's not do that." And as you grow up as a teenager, especially a teenage girl who already has so many issues with body image and self-esteem, watching disabled women on screen who were often presented as evil or villains or grotesques. It only got worse for me growing up, being like, is this what I'm going to grow up into? Is this what I'm going to look like? So, I think that was another part of writing the book that was really kind of cathartic, is being like, this is what the movies have taught me, rightly and wrongly, and this is why I've grown up the way I am. And it's taken a lot of years for me to kind of unlearn that part of how filmmaking has sold me what my disabled life should look like.
And now a message from Jordan Ramirez for Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez.
I want to take a break from this episode to thank my listeners/viewers who watch the videos on my YouTube channel and listen to each new episode on Spotify. While this show is a labor of love and passion that isn't about the movies that I like, this is also a show that is about the films that you like. Have a film that you want to recommend to the podcast? Make sure to recommend it in the comments section on YouTube and on Spotify, and you will receive a shout out in a future episode. Want to be a guest on the podcast? Click on the sign up form link in the episode description for further details. If you like this episode or my previous episodes, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more interviews in the near future. The goal for this channel is to reach up to 100 subscribers both on YouTube and on Spotify. It's just that easy. And now, back to our regularly scheduled episode. Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing I wanted to mention, because I liked this chapter that you had titled "Full Retard." You It was directly quoted from a movie that everybody thought you can't make today. Well, you couldn't make it back then, was the issue. Tropic Thunder, which almost everybody would say they remembered that film, but they would overlook this one portion of the film where Robert Downey Jr. has said, "You can never go full retard." Having able-bodied actors playing mentally challenged characters. In your book, you mentioned about the character of Lenny from Of Mice and Men, who was not only played by Lon Chaney Jr. in the 1939 film adaptation, but he was also played by John Malkovich in the 1992 film adaptation. And the films that you mentioned that had a sort of like Lenny gentle giant sort of archetype were like films like Charlie, Rain Man, Forrest Gump, and Sling Blade. And you also mentioned the films like The Other Sister and I Am Sam. What was like the most responsive element? Well, let me first go back and say I did like the movie Charlie, but I know that the film has very much like problematic issues with the fact that it has a protagonist who is at first mentally challenged, and then he becomes this sort of jerk type character. And at one moment, he almost sexually assaulted Claire Bloom in one scene. But what was like your point of trying to make readers aware? Like you're not trying to trash these movies, you're trying to make them aware or critique the chapter on this full retard. Like what was the idea of like trying to re-emphasize this?
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of the book, and I say it in the intro, is that, I don't begrudge anybody that loves these movies, any of the movies in the book. I love a lot of these movies in the book. I love Forrest Gump,
Hmm.
I love Freaks. I love a lot of these movies, and I don't begrudge anybody that says that, the goal is not to shame or make anybody feel bad for enjoying these. But my hope is that people will watch these movies and ask some questions. Why are all disabled people white men? Why are people who are neurodivergent in these movies all either geniuses or childlike innocence? Why does everybody want to magically be cured?
Hmm.
So the hope is that they'll ask questions and they'll notice why movies do what they do with regards to disabled people. And hopefully create more disabled allies and make disabled people feel like somebody understands, why if they don't like a movie that I understand it. I get why
Hmm.
you don't. With neurodivergence, it was tough because I don't have cognitive disabilities. I have ADHD, but that's not at all the same thing as, autism or having mental disabilities. It was the same question I asked when I was talking about wanting to add a section about disability and color. I'm a white passing woman, so I have privilege there. But I figured it would be irresponsible for me to just ignore those two things just because I didn't have that lived experience. So, when it came to cognitive disabilities, I kind of filtered it through. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of the tropes are similar irrespective of specific disability. And I think
Hmm.
cognitive disabilities, most people know the stereotypes, that they're hyper aware of it. And the things like all neurodivergent people are geniuses, they're
Hmm.
hidden geniuses, Rain Man, they all have these little quirks. And they're also sold as, these are usually men who have neurodivergence, and they're eccentric. There's a line between quirky and eccentric, and that's where Tropic Thunder comes in.
Hmm.
Because when I saw Tropic Thunder and I heard that sequence with Robert Downey Jr. using the R word and talking about those movies, people got so wrapped up in the use of him using that word that
Hmm.
they didn't look at the context of the speech, which is incredibly true, which is
Hmm.
that people playing neurodivergent characters, there is a line. There is a line for what an audience will find acceptable, and there is a line for what Oscar voters will reward with an Oscar. And
Hmm.
all of that has to do with aesthetics and has to do with how much use the disabled character provides to an able person. And there is a third thing, which is it quirky? Is it eccentric? Yes. Cannot be off-putting.
Hmm.
So much of neurodivergence in film has to be that the audience will not find the character disturbing. And
Hmm.
that's something that we need to really talk about. So, in the case of Dustin Hoffman and Rain Man, Dustin Hoffman looks like Dustin Hoffman. He
Hmm.
doesn't have any facial tics. He doesn't have anything that makes him displeasing to the eye. And his mental disabilities in this movie are fun. They're funny to the audience. He can count matchsticks. He helps Tom Cruise win all this money in Vegas. He's useful. Who doesn't want, this guy with them? Never mind the fact that Rain Man is the story of a privileged white guy who gets pissed that he doesn't get an inheritance from his dad and kidnaps his half brother and uses him as a bargaining chip in a custody battle. That's
Hmm.
essentially what it boils down to for as a conservatorship.
Hmm.
People forget all that. They get all wrapped up in the like fun trip to Vegas and Wapner of it all, which I think is really, really upsetting. But because of all of those things, the audience finds that fun. The Academy finds that charming and they reward it with an Oscar. Same with, you know, um, um, Forrest Gump, Tom Hanks.
Hmm.
Not visually unappealing, still looks like Tom Hanks. Does a lot of fun, cool historical things. Plays ping pong.
Hmm.
And gets to have this great life. Never mind the Forrest Gump is generationally wealthy and also, related to a Ku Klux Klansman. Um, but then you have something like I Am Sam, which still got nominated for an Oscar. People forget Sean Penn still got nominated. He just didn't win. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Sean Penn goes actually present you what neurodivergence can look like. He's got the slack jaw, he's got the faraway glance, he talks in this affected manner, he's more childlike. The disability is not charming. It's real, and people don't want that. And I Am Sam is not a good movie. I want that stipulated. It's not a good movie, but it tells a very real story about a mentally disabled man trying to raise a child, and how society believes that because he is mentally disabled, he should not raise a child. That is a real thing that happens to countless families in America and abroad.
Mhm.
And we should have a movie about that. The problem is that Sean Penn plays the character so aggressively, like it's so aggressive. Everything he does, whether he's pratfalling and falling on his face, or whether he's yelling all of his dialogue, it's a lot.
Mhm.
But I think at the end of the day, an audience also just does not want to be reminded of the authenticity of some neurodivergence. They want something charming and innocent and eccentric.
Mhm.
And that's I think that's what I think Tropic Thunder is getting at. And I don't think audiences were ready to have that conversation when Tropic Thunder came out. I still don't think they're ready to have that conversation today, which is
Mhm.
why we're in this weird landscape of we love to present neurodivergence, but it's, again, it's still that good doctor format of like
Mhm.
somebody that is hyper intelligent, and maybe, maybe they're just socially awkward. You still are not getting people, you'll get the occasional maybe Down syndrome actor, which is good. But that's about it. It's still that focus on what the audience is going to find pleasant to watch, which is still a problem.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, as somebody with 80 with autistic spectrum disorder, it does somewhat bother me to see certain abled actors playing disabled roles. And as much as I like some of these neurodivergent characters, I I always find them somewhat annoying to me because to me, even though they claim to be geniuses and they claim to be smart, I'm like, just shut up. I want to hear what the other character says.
And I mean, I think that's the problem that I think a lot of people have, is this idea that neurodivergence is presented as this kind of superpower, right?
Hmm.
And that everybody with neurodivergence is just waiting to be a doctor, or waiting
Hmm.
to be a lawyer, or waiting to be something, never mind that I forget the exact statistic that says that, people with savant tendencies, it's not the majority,
Mm-mm.
it's not, I think it's maybe about 5% of people with autism have savant qualities.
Hmm.
And yeah, you wouldn't know that in film when it's every person,
Hmm.
and I think that sets up, I can only imagine that sets up this idea that, like, well, if I'm not a savant and I can't, do math really well, or I can't do this, where do I fit then?
Absolutely. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about is you mentioned a number of movies in this book. Were there certain movies that you wanted to put into the book, but because of the context of the film, or maybe because there were not enough information, that you just did not know where to fit it in? Like, were there types of those movies where you didn't get quite a chance to figure out where to put it in?
I think the one that I always say that I wish I had included, and just because of time and a lot of other things, I forgot to put it in, was the Creed films. I would have loved to have included Tessa Thompson, who is playing a deaf actor or deaf character in the Creed films, and Creed 2 follows them having a child that has deafness, and how do they navigate that. I would have loved to include that, and just for the time of writing the manuscript, I wasn't able to.
Mm.
I got a lot of suggestions from friends. Friends would be like, "Have you seen this movie?" And a lot of what I was focused on, the book is not comprehensive.
Hmm.
I really wanted to focus on things that I knew had specific tropes that I could kind of dive into, that I
Hmm.
could kind of not rip apart, but dissect, and really deconstruct. So a lot of people's suggestions would be like, well, I saw this movie and there's a wheelchair user in it. And I was like, yeah, but like, what are they doing? And
Hmm.
it was either something that it was either a small part, or it wasn't really a huge film, or I already had another movie that I thought did a lot more, or I had at least had an angle that I could go with it. I looked at everything very journalistically,
Mhm.
which is like, what's the angle that I could kind of use this film for? So there were a lot of stray movies that people would kind of recommend to me where I was like, yeah, but I got something better, that I can kind of that tells the same thing, but there's more to it.
Yeah. I mean, my thought was, I mean, I've seen the David Cronenberg film Crash and it had like a person with crutches, but I feel like, yeah, but she's not the main character. She's sort of like the minor character of the story. So I thought
Yeah.
I could have put that in there because there is a section in the book where you mention like not all disabled the only thing that I took away the one of the chapters that you mentioned was that all characters with disabilities, maybe wheelchair users, is that they're portrayed as asexual and that they don't like have any sexual or romantic like fling-ons with except with the exception of the movie Coming Home between Jane Fonda and John Voight, which you mentioned in the book.
Yeah, I mean, disability is one of those where we're slowly starting to see that tide turn. You have something like Lolo Spencer in this Sex Lives of College Girls, who is a sexual woman. But again, there's a lot of aesthetic that still plays into it.
Mhm.
There Lolo Spencer in that film, I mean, she's gorgeous. She's also proportionate. So there's a lot that goes into, I think, the presentation of sexuality when it comes to disability. And that concept of sex, I think, is something that people are still very like weirded out by.
Hmm.
You look at something like Home of the Brave, which is the a Jessica Biel war movie where Jessica Biel is an amputee. She's missing an arm. And like the sex scene that they have in that movie, we don't see it, by the way.
Mm.
Like we don't actually watch them having sex, but she takes her shirt off and the shirt gets caught on the prosthesis. And you're like,
Mm.
I've talked to people that have limb difference and they're like, why would she even have the arm on? It's not needed during the sex act. They're like, why would you even have it? But there's that belief that like it
Hmm.
needs to be present. I know when I talked to Don Mancini, the director of the Chucky films, and he talked about doing Cult of Chucky, that he had a scene where the heroine has sex with a man in her wheelchair. And he said that the response from the predominantly female executives was not that she was having sex, but that she was having sex in the wheelchair.
Mm.
And he was like, what does it matter? Like that was the issue. So I
Mm.
still think there is a lot of hesitation to emphasize disability when we are seeing these sex scenes. So people are
Mm.
like, we're okay with you guys having sex. We just don't want to be reminded of it while you're doing it, which is weird. It's very bizarre that like there's still these lines, that we have to navigate. But it's still a rarity. We
Mm.
don't have enough disabled characters, period, let alone disabled characters having sex and having relationships. Most disabled characters, we're not really seeing what their personal life looks like. We're not seeing them in relationships because we're not seeing them at all.
Hmm.
So, and especially women, I think that's the big thing. We don't have enough disabled women. Disabled men in movies can have those relationships. Mind you, they don't always work out. Like in something like The Upside with Bryan Cranston. But we're not getting nearly enough disabled women because the
Hmm.
belief is that disabled women aren't, the term I use in the book, they're not fuckable. So what happens with disabled women is you get a lot of movies that prioritize trauma.
Mm.
So something like The Shape of Water, something like Hush, where the fear is of sexual violence, that the only man that's going to be interested in you is a man that wants to hurt you.
Mm.
And I think that that's something that really needs to change. Yes, the stats for rape and assault against disabled women is very high,
Hmm.
but if that's the only I mean it's a similar message I think that a lot of marginalized women are asking for it. The indigenous community wants the same thing. They're sick of seeing stories about indigenous women being assaulted. Disabled
Hmm.
women, I think we're at that same point where, why does every time there's a disabled woman, it's got to be some creep who wants to, commit violence.
Mm.
So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done with upending these narratives about sex and disability.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, um, I'm sort of at that point where I wanted to get into a relationship regardless of my disability, but I have yet to make it to that point. So yeah, I do somewhat find it frustrating that when it comes to movies and the portrayal of sex and the portrayal of sex with a disabled character and also hopefully a disabled woman, we don't see a lot of that. It's sort of like we're basically going into like I don't know, like this puritanical later regressive moment is what I'm seeing is
Yeah,
and
and I mean a lot of these movies sell the idea that the best person to date if you're disabled is another disabled person,
hmm
which you know, if that's a person's choice, that's great. But at the same time, it kind of keeps that loop very small, and it does have this yucky feeling of eugenics where it's like
hmm
keep it in your own lane, don't start spreading it around to the able-bodied people. It's got this really weird like yuck factor to it. And it's something
hmm
I talk about in the few times where you do see interabled relationships, it's always a caretaker. The
hmm
line between caretaker and sex worker in movies is very blurry. And that is not something that should be happening at all, but it kind of keeps that loop small, which is that, if you're a disabled person and you have to date an able person, make it somebody that's actually willing to care for you.
hmm
And again, that's also a problem. Caretakers are overburdened, they're undersupported, and I think there is still this stigma that, you don't date a disabled person because what if they get sick? That they're gonna have problems. Do you really want to deal with that?
hmm
And I think the stats are very telling. The stats are ridiculously, there's a disparity between able men who will stay in a relationship with a woman that has a terminal illness or disabled, whereas women will stay in relationships with men who have disabilities or a terminal illness.
hmm
And the movies certainly sell that concept, in some way. There's a lot of relationships I talk about in the book where, the abled character is just like, I can't handle this. I don't want to deal with it. And that's the problem. It's kind of, it puts the burden on us as disabled people to be like, well, who the heck is going to care for me, when I get old? And that's not the reason to get into a relationship. I don't want somebody to care for me. I take care of myself. It's the same. I think we all quest for the same thing, which is just like companionship and love. And movies are kind of saying like, yeah, your parents are your best caretakers. Stick with them. And then once you get old, hopefully you'll just die early so you won't have to worry about it. And that's really something that I think movies really need to start talking about, especially as we know people are living longer and we know
hmm
people are becoming disabled more frequently because of long COVID.
hmm
So, I mean, ultimately that's kind of what I wanted to write the book for. People watch disabled movies about disability, and they sell this concept that disability is something you should mourn. If you
hmm
become disabled, you have lost a part of yourself and you need to grieve that part. And it's really not. It's not. I mean, I remember having a discussion with a woman in public who thought this was okay, who was telling me, I hope whatever you have gets better. And I was
mm.
like, I've lived in this wheelchair 30 years. It's not getting better. And she was like, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have said anything. And I was like,
Mm.
why? Why are you sorry? Like, my life is not sad, ma'am.
Mm-mm.
Like, but there is this belief that, disability is something sad, it's something tragic. So I understand able people when they freak out about like long COVID and stuff like that. Yeah, I understand you're scared because movies have been telling you for 100 years that you should be upset, that it's a death sentence. And
Mhm.
it's not, it's just a different way. And I think there are movies that are telling that story. It's just that, there's not enough of them. For every Sound of Metal, we go 5, 6 years without a disabled story. So
Mhm.
there's just not enough to kind of balance everything.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is very telling that we are living in the societal realm right now where one day you hope that Coda, the movie that is discussed in the book, featured disabled actors. You had a disabled narrative, and that it could have launched more movies of this narrative. But instead, it was, as you mentioned, it's a sort of regression to not see that much progress. It's like they always say it's the first step, but it's always that same thing. I always hear somebody tell me it's the first step, and it's like, okay, next year it's the first step. Next year it's the first step, and I keep hearing the same thing over and over again. It's like, no, you're not making progress. You're doing the same stats. It's almost like it's creeping up to maybe 1% or 2%, but that's still low in the statistics.
Yeah, Annenberg just put out their latest study from last year, and disability representation is the same amount as it's been since 2015. So it
Mm-hmm.
has actually not moved. I think it's at 1.5 or 1.3% right now, and it
Mm-hmm.
has not moved
Yeah.
in 11 years.
Yeah.
And I think that if anything too, with the current administration, there is a real fear that we are going to continue to step back. We've already seen it with Latino representation and with Asian representation. This concept that woke is dead,
Mm-hmm.
and the belief that nobody wants to see those movies, disability is going to be affected by that.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a real Hollywood is clearly aware that there needs to be acknowledgement. So you'll see disabled people in background scenes. You'll see the frame maybe filled with disabled people, but we still don't have enough disabled characters, and we sure as hell don't have enough disabled directors, screenwriters, people working behind the scenes. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where I kind of say casting is the floor. It's
Mm-hmm.
super easy to do. You would think that studios would just do it, and then they'd be like, you can shut up about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's but at the same time, if we can't get disabled performers in, then we're not going to get people behind the camera. And that's
Mm-hmm.
where I'm really interested in. I'm far more interested in a movie that maybe has a disabled screenwriter or a disabled DP or something. That being said, there's a lot of need for allies. 1 in 4 has a disability. That means 3 and 4 don't. So by sheer numbers, we kind of need those Hollywood allies. And there's been a lot of people that have talked about it, and I kind of want them to do something about it at this point. If Steven Spielberg wanted to make the lead of his movie a disabled person, he could do that. He would have a
Mm-hmm.
far easier time doing that than me on my soapbox. If he wanted to work on a script with a disabled screenwriter, he could do that. He
Mm-hmm.
just has to want to do that. And I think that's where we're at right now. How do we get allies to want to work with us? And Hollywood is only getting smaller.
Mm-hmm.
Studios are buying other studios. There's less films being made, with money behind them. So it's a problem. It's a growing problem. And Coda, I got told a lot. This is our moment. This is what's going to happen. 5 years
Mm-hmm.
later, nothing happened. But
No.
I remember, I'm sure people said when Marlee Matlin won the Oscar in the 80s for Children of a Lesser Crowd, I'm sure people said, this is it. It's gonna happen. I'm sure when Coming Home came out and John Voight won, with the Oscars, this is the moment. It's gonna
Mm-hmm.
happen. We've been saying that for, 50 odd years in
Mm-hmm.
entertainment. And so I do think at this point it's a combination of factors that need to happen, which is that, creatives need to care and they need to want to work with disabled people. We're also not writing enough disabled people.
Mm-hmm.
We're not writing enough disabled characters in films, but I think also we need to just start casting disabled people in roles, period. They
Mm-hmm.
don't have to be disabled. The only time I tend to see people looking for disabled characters is when a disabled character maybe is in a book that
Mm-hmm.
they're adapting and they're like, well, the character's disabled in the book. We need a disabled person.
Yeah.
Right, but like you could also cast disabled people in roles that aren't disabled.
Mm-hmm.
that are just a person, and they maybe just have a limb difference. And then you can pat yourself on the back, like the character was written as able, but we cast a disabled person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really the next thing. It needs to be on allies. It needs to be on studios to be like, you can do it. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening right now with ASL in film.
Mm-hmm.
Disney just released an announcement that they're going to do sign language they're redoing animated films with sign language
Mm-hmm.
in the film. HBO and Warner Brothers have done some great things with their Barbie ASL interpreters. Those are things where, I'm hoping that now they've proven that you can integrate ASL into storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
So now maybe write a character that only speaks through ASL, and tell that story. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
make an animated film with a character who is deaf and only speaks through ASL. We've proven you can do it.
Mm-hmm.
People just have to care and want to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also mentioned in the book about a few films that came out in a few years ago. One of them you mentioned a film called A Different Man, the Sebastian Stan movie that featured Pearson. Oh my
Adam
goodness,
Pearson.
Adam Pearson, uh, a real life actor with a disability who you mentioned in the book that even though Sebastian Stan's character, he has the facial surgery and he looks perfect and he can now be able-bodied. He doesn't feel like he has those luxuries. And instead, Adam Pearson's character gets all the luxuries because of the fact that even though he has like a facial deformity, that he is, seen as he gets more friends, he gets more respect than Sebastian Stan's character does. And I thought that is an interesting. I remembered seeing the trailer and maybe at first my head thought, oh, this guy looked like this wasn't real. And I thought, no, it is real. It is his real face. Um, and I thought that is a really impressive thing to turn those tropes around. And it is sort of a start that I wanted to see more of that. But as you said, we need more allies. We need more people who care about these issues. And my biggest concern is, I mean, I know that the studios are getting much smaller. The studios are buying up one another. And you said Disney's doing a good start. My concern is not just with that, but also with like, let's say, artificial intelligence and also CG and also certain things like if the mainstream studios won't be able to handle the stories, do you think independent filmmakers could try to fill in that gap, or maybe it's like you're reaching a step too far?
I mean, it's tough because I mean, A Different Man came out via A24, which is a major independent studio. And it did really well. I think people were surprised at how well it did. It garnered Sebastian Stan a Golden Globe. There was hope that maybe it would garner him an Oscar nomination. Um, the indie space is certainly more of an opportunity for filmmakers who want to take risks. Because right now, Hollywood is very closed off. The
Mm-hmm.
way that most movies are getting made now is through IP. So you have to have a strong IP or some sort of franchise. And right now, a lot of deals are packages. So what will happen is a producer will already have a A-list director, an A-list script, and two or three A-list stars. And then they'll go to a studio like Warner Brothers and say, well, I already have all these people signed. And all these things are top quality. And so, because of that package mentality, it doesn't benefit a producer to go to a studio and be like, hi, I have an A-list director and an A-list script, but I have these two disabled performers that nobody's heard of. The studio is going to be like, we're not going to do that unless it's maybe like, again, Steven Spielberg or somebody who has a proven track record of they're going to make money.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I think, a big thing that's limiting disabled talent from getting opportunities and disabled in front of and behind the camera. But A Different Man, I think, the fact that Aaron Schimberg was able to write that script, he was able to cast Adam Pearson and he was able to sell it to A24 with an A-lister. He had one at the time with Sebastian Stan. Renata Reinsve, who is the female lead in that movie, has now gone on to be an Oscar nominee.
Yeah.
So she is also now a big name, but
Mm-hmm.
he was able to make that movie because he had, two big A-list stars. That's why I say allyship is so important. You know,
Mm-hmm.
when when the Peanut Butter Falcon came out, the Zach Gottsagen movie, that movie also got traction. It was able to get made because it had Dakota Johnson and unfortunately Shia LaBeouf, who was a big star at the time, as supporting cast.
Hmm.
So, the stars do have the ability to do, to get things accomplished. Sebastian Stan doing his Golden Globe speech and advocating for these stories is great. I
Hmm.
hope he continues to advocate and go, and work on projects and be like, where's the disabled people? Like, what can we do to get more of them there? And A Different Man, I think, is so audacious. It's so inventive. Every time I watch it, it's great. And it was funny because I heard from a lot of disabled people when I would talk about how much I loved it, who were like, Sebastian Stan's playing a disabled person. How can you support that? And I'm like, have you seen the movie? And they're like, no, but I saw a trailer. I'm like, well, that's the problem. The trailer is telling you something. It talks so much about internalized ableism and
Yeah.
the stereotypes
Hang
that,
on. I'm
yeah,
getting a call. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, no worries.
Yes, Mom. No, I didn't. I'm in the middle of an interview. Yeah. Sorry about
Oh, no, no
that.
worries.
Okay. No, no. Okay. So what were you saying before I cut off?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people were it talks so much about internalized ableism and it talks about all of the stereotypes that movies have sold us, which is that, if you get this magic cure, and it quite literally is a magic cure in the movie, that all your problems will be solved. And Sebastian Stan's character, Edward, gets all of his problems solved. He gets to look like Sebastian Stan, and his life is everything that it should be. And it's that very real disabled thing that we experience where it's like somebody else is able to have all those things that I could have had
Hmm.
and be themselves. What am I doing wrong that like that doesn't, and it's so smart. And I don't know any other movie that would have even touched those issues or understood it.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, so, uh, so I got a few more questions, since we'll wrap things up a little bit. So what do you think people will take away from this book since our discussion about it for those who like these movies but think that it's a trashing of the movies, which we're saying it's not. It is a critique on certain movies that even though everybody likes them, and I'm not saying that I'm trashing some of your those favorite movies, but they have some flaws, and we have to look at it from how these studios made these pictures. So what do you think? What is your hope that maybe people will take from this book that we have discussed in the interview?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I don't want people to hate these movies. I want them to look at movies a bit closer and I want them to ask questions. Media literacy is dying right now. And I
Hmm.
think that we all want people to be looking at the content that they're consuming and ask more questions. I've watched all of these movies countless times. And I just want people to, kind of understand where I'm coming from when I watch them as a disabled person and watch them as an able person. I live with able people. I interact with able people all the time. So, the hope is that somebody will watch something and maybe ask a question, be more interested in disability, more aware of disabled issues and disabled lives. And also maybe discover a new favorite. I talk about movies that are not, critically beloved,
Hmm.
or not well known, that I appreciate and that I've come to enjoy. And they'll maybe discover a new favorite. Maybe they'll watch The Other Sister, which has been critically maligned for most of its, existence, and be like, hey, why did this movie get criticized? Is it a bad movie or is it because Juliette Lewis is, not Mallory Knox and Natural Born Killers? Maybe they'll watch The Water Dance and they'll learn about, Neil Jimenez, who was the disabled co-director of that film and how that movie presents disability. Maybe they'll find a new movie that they love, like A Different Man. They'll be like, this movie's great. How did I miss it? So for every movie that I have an issue with that I talk about, like Million Dollar Baby, I talk about two or three movies that I love and that I want people to actually watch.
Hmm. I mean, I could have talked about Million Dollar Baby, but I know that you covered it in the book, and it was also covered in the documentary as well, and that it was, I think, heavily criticized at the time, especially regarding Hilary Swank's character and what happened to her at the end, which I know I've seen the clips of it, but I don't but I was very hesitant to see the movie at
You
first.
don't need to see the movie. It's not, it's, I don't think it's very good.
Hmm.
Disability aside, I just do not think it's a good movie.
Yeah.
But again, a lot of people love it. I hope that somebody reads the book and then goes to watch Million Dollar Baby, and be like, yeah, why does she have to spend like the last 30 minutes of this movie in pain and suffering?
Hmm.
Why does the Morgan Freeman character not have a first name? I think Million Dollar Baby might also be a little racist.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean that's kind of the hope, is that they'll watch a movie that they already enjoy, and they'll just know about the disability side of it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, do you have any future plans? I know that you're already a critic, and do you is this like your first step, and maybe you could write more of this, or where does it go from here?
Yeah, so I mean this was my second book. I published my first one in 2023 for Turner Classic Movies and Running Press. And I have two more books. I have a book coming out this year in July, which is another a continuation of my TCM book that I did. So if you love romance, literary adaptations, I have a book called But Have You Read the Book, Volume 2, Romance Edition.
Hmm.
And I'm in edits right now on a big oral history about the TV series Tales from the Crypt.
Hmm.
So that's going to come out next summer. So more, book writing. I don't know if I'm going to write more books. I wrote three in 3 years, so I'm very tired. And I
Hmm.
don't know if I'll continue. I'll write another disability book. But my criticism, I write all the time about disability in the movies. It's a huge thing for me. So, I'm a full-time freelance entertainment journalist and critic. So I'll continue to be writing about these topics. I have a huge social media, so you can follow me there and find out when I'm writing more about disability. And then I have my newsletter, The Film Maven, at thefilmmaven.com, where I have a whole little supplementary series that I do called Popcorn Disabilities, where I talk about other movies that aren't included in the book, or have random thoughts about certain things related to disability. So I don't see this being the last time I'll talk about disability in the movies. Will it be my last book on disability in the movies? Who knows?
Yeah, absolutely. But thank you so much. And I know as a huge TCM fan, and I know I wanted to meet Ben Mankiewicz. I never got to meet Robert Osborne, but Ben Mankiewicz is the closest that I wish I could beat. If
Uh,
yeah,
Ben's great. Ben's
uh,
great. I was very happy that he wanted to write my foreword, even after I told him he was my second choice.
absolutely, yeah. But if I ever do run into him or anything like that, I'll mention you. And
Please do. I'm hopefully gonna run into him at the end of the month at the TCM Classic Film Festival. So, I'm hoping he got his copy of the book, which I did send him.
oh
So,
yeah,
fingers
absolutely.
crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But thank
Well,
you so much.
yeah, thank you for being on the show. So, Kristen Lopez, author of the book Popcorn Disability, The Highs and Lows of Disabled Representation in the Movies. And before we wrap things up, so where can people find you, look you up, or find this book?
Yeah, you can find the book wherever you buy your books. Ask your local library if they have it, because I know books are expensive. So you can buy it anywhere. There is an audiobook if you are hard of hearing or you need that format. It does exist, which is something I fought for. And then you can find me on social media. I'm at Kristen K. Lopez, unless it is Instagram, where I could not get that handle. I'm at Kristen Lopez 88 over there. And then I have my newsletter, The Film Maven, that goes out 4 times a week. You can subscribe to that. And I do have a podcast because everybody has a podcast. I've been doing it for 10 years. It's called Ticklish Business. It's about old Hollywood.
Hmm.
You can find that wherever you listen to podcasts.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
I always wanted to go on another person's podcast like yours. I mean, it would be nice it would be nice. I don't know how I would have to, do I have to like submit my credentials or how would I
No,
be?
we can keep in touch. Well, we can talk off air and we can figure something out. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Kristen, for being on this podcast. And it was really great talking about this book and learning a lot about disabled representation in the movies and what we hope in the future we can see more representation of disabled characters and disabled people both on and off camera in the future. So thank you so much for being on this episode.
Thank you, Jordan. I appreciate it.
Okay, this is Jordan Ramirez signing off on Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez with Kristen Lopez. And until then, I'll see you at the movies. And Kristen, again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.